We all know that change is difficult, but social change takes a long time. With his relentless publishing, training, seminars, speaking engagement, and these days, even a series of YouTube videos, Al Condeluci is being heard around the world, and our communities are much better off for it. In fact, Al did not take a minute to rest today. He made use of his time in Ottawa for appearances on Rogers Daytime, which I hear is a pretty good show, CFRA, and CBC Radio, and a discussion with the LiveWorkPlay staff team. Al Condeluci is CEO of Community Living and Support Services, also known as CLASS, a community-based support system in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He holds an MSW and PhD from the University of Pittsburgh, where he is on faculty in the School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences and the School of Social Work. He has authored 7 books, including the brand new Macro Change Handbook. It's all about social capital. So please join me now in demonstrating our appreciation for Al coming all the way here from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, here today. Ladies and gentlemen, Al Condeluci. Come on up here, Al.
Thank you. Thanks, Dave. Thank you, Dave. Well, what an honor to be here as a part of the celebration. And I just want to thank Keenan and Julie and the board of directors of LiveWorkPlay for the opportunity to celebrate with you and to be a part of this incredible evening. And as Derek was going down memory lane and kind of sharing the start point of this fine organization, I was thinking about my intersection with Keenan and Julie about 10 years ago in terms of meeting them at a conference and having an opportunity to share some ideas and compare some notes. But even more powerful was the philosophical connection that I felt with both Julie and with Keenan and with the work that LiveWorkPlay does. And as we spent some time together and had an opportunity to compare and share some notes, it's really led to me coming up here a couple times and meeting with the staff and being a part of the board retreat, and then this invitation tonight. And so tonight I wanted to share with you a little bit of the philosophy that really drives, I believe, the work we need to do, and not just with LiveWorkPlay's involvement, but really within the entire disability community in the world, not just in Canada or the United States or North America, but around the world, because we are at a really important juncture. And so I wanted to just share some thoughts with you about this idea of how do we help people build full and inclusive relationships. And it really starts with my own relationship with my cousin Carrie. It's a picture of my cousin Carrie. We grew up together. We were age contemporaries, and we grew up together on Condeluci Hill in Pittsburgh, which was where my family lived. And there were 8 Condeluci families who grew up, who were living on the hill, and Carrie and I lived right beside each other. And so we shared these very early experiences of brotherhood, sisterhood. And Carrie and I were really inseparable. We were exactly the same age. We went and did everything together until I went off to school, and Carrie didn't go to school. And I remember asking my mama about that, and my mama said, "Honey, Carrie's different." And I didn't understand that. I mean, I never saw Carrie as different, and certainly on Condeluci Hill, Carrie was just a natural part of who we were as a family. But Carrie was perceived to be different. My mom said that she really couldn't learn, and so therefore she didn't have to go to school. So I was a little curious about that, and I said, "You mean, what makes her different, Mama?" And my mom says, "Well, she has Down syndrome. And so she really is different from all the other kids in school. Consequently, she doesn't have to go to school." So I said, Mommy, you mean to tell me if you have Down syndrome, you don't have to go to school? And my mom says, yeah. And I said, how can I get Down syndrome so I don't have to go to school either? But in reality, it was really a very early introduction, a very, very, I want to say, simple introduction to who's valued in community and who's not, and why some people are not valued. And so as we got a little bit older, Carrie and I, we began to go off the hill for social events and football games and, festivals in community. And I began to experience another sense of devaluation in terms of how Carrie was treated. People would make fun of her. People would disregard her. They would play jokes on her. And maybe most powerful, people didn't even acknowledge her as a person. And as a young boy, this was really compelling to me because I just didn't understand why people or how people could be mean to somebody else. And so I knew that this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to help Carrie and people like Carrie be valued in community. And so I talked to my counselors and I said, I want to help people like Carrie. And my counselor said, well, Al, you have to understand that Carrie is different. And different people need to be supported in programs. And so you have to go to college to understand those differences. And what did I know? I was the first Condeluci to go to college. So I thought, well, okay, maybe this is accurate. Maybe I do have to understand Carrie's difference. And this idea of difference is really powerful in our society because oftentimes when we perceive somebody to be different from us, we back away from them. We are suspicious of them. We're nervous about them. We have certain stereotypes perhaps about their difference, and that creates a huge barrier between connectedness and isolation. And so I started in college to study difference. And as I began to study this idea of difference and graduated and began to create some programs and services for people who were different, I really began to rethink my perspective. That was Carrie the problem? Was her difference really the problem? Or was the community the problem? And was the community's insensitivity or perhaps ignorance about Carrie the real problem? And so this idea, this reframing from Carrie being the problem or the different person being the problem to perhaps the community being the problem really sent me on a new journey. This idea of how do we change the community? How do we get the everyday person in Ottawa or at Pittsburgh or any of the other cities in our countries? How do we get those people to get beyond the difference that they see in people like Carrie? And so this notion, this shift from micro to macro really got me into a whole new place. And I began as an advocate to work toward changing the community. How can I change your behavior? How can I get you to open your hearts and maybe your minds and maybe to open up your jobs, your homes, to people like Carrie? And as I began to think about that and began to study that, I was taught that we have to change community by changing the laws of our society. And so I got to it. I became an advocate for changing the laws. I became a radical, actually. And I got involved in radical movements to change housing laws in Pennsylvania, in my own state, to change national laws in our country, in the United States, to break open the system so that it could embrace people with disabilities. And after I did all this work, changing the laws, civil rights, ADA, housing rights, transportation rights, I stepped back and said, has the community really changed? And what I began to discover is that actually trying to force the community to change is not, it doesn't create culture change. trying to force you to change. If I grabbed you by the lapels and said, change your perspective toward my cousin Carrie, see her vision, see her value, that doesn't necessarily make you change. And so I went back to school, I began to think this out, and I began to reshift. Because clearly, the more laws sometimes that we have in our society, the less justice that we sometimes see. And so this got me into this whole new perspective. How can we change the community, not through legislation or policy, but through relationships? This led me to the construct of social capital. Social capital sounds like a big concept, but all that it means is that our relationships matter, and that you and I are influenced by the people that we build relationships around us. And so, as I began to study social capital academically, went back to school, got my PhD, studied this, began teaching it at the university, I began to learn some lessons that I want to quickly share with you this evening about this notion of social capital. Because herein, I think, lies the core of an organization like LiveWorkPlay. What we're about here with LiveWorkPlay is not necessarily to hold our fists up and to somehow, some way demand that society change, but through one person at a time, building relationships, and our staff at LiveWorkPlay reaching out and creating bridges to community, we can change the world. Let me just kind of share with you that social capital as a construct is really about our friendships and the networks that we have in our lives. And these networks are incredibly valuable to us. That every one of us in this room, if we perceive ourselves to be successful, is not because we're so smart or cool or good looking or, I don't know, functional or dexterous. The reason why we're successful in our lives is because of the other people around us. And that every one of us in this room have had people in our lives that have propped us up, that have supported us, that have taught us, that have challenged us. Every once and again, they might have kicked us in the butt. They loved us when we were needing it most. And it was through those relationships, our social capital, that we began to find our success in life. And so, with this notion of social capital, I want to share with you that sociologists who have studied this, and I'm right in the mix of that. I've been studying social capital as a framework for the last 5 years in my work at the University of Pittsburgh. But what we know is that the most important things in life, and here they are, by the way, these are the highest quality of life indicators known to human beings: health, happiness, and longevity. These three things in every culture all around the world always rise to the top of what's most important in life. And yet, these three things are really tied to the relationships we have in life. Quite simply, you're healthier, you're happier, and listen to this, you'll live longer based on the prominence of your relationships in life. Now, this notion of relationships being so important to life really got me to think about the relationships that people with disabilities experience. And as I began to study that, I learned some really interesting things. That the average person, for example, folks in this room, have about 150 important relationships. About 150. I know what you're doing. I'm looking over there. I see Derek. He's going like this. He's counting. But in fact, you have, probably most of the people in this room have more than 150. But 150 is about average. After I learned that, I looked at our own work in Pittsburgh with the people we serve, and I sat down with folks in our service system, and I began to try to measure how many relationships do you have in your life. And what I discovered was that it was woefully different. It was incredibly different from most of us in this room. In fact, the average number of relationships with people that we measured, not just in Pittsburgh, but in Toronto, in Vancouver, in Kansas City, in Portland, Maine, in San Jose, in Brisbane, Australia, places where we've done our research, we've discovered that the average number of relationships is about 25 for people like my cousin Carrie. And if you stop and you think about this, we know that not just people with disabilities that are developmental in nature like many of the people we support at LiveWorkPlay, but people who have acquired disabilities also lose relationships. I saw this happen with my dad when he came down with Parkinson's. And as my dad experienced Parkinson's, his life began to shrink. And people began to back away. And people began to say, poor Mr. Condeluci, you know, he's shaking, he's struggling. Let's give him his space. And my dad's relationships began to dwindle. And so this notion of social isolation is at the core of what Live, Work, and Play is all about. It's about the notion that with relationships we're better. Not just the person who has a disability, but the rest of the community that the relationships are built around. And so, quite simply, the more social capital you have, not only are you healthier and happier and live longer, but look at these other things we know are associated with our relationships. That literally people are more tolerant with people they have relationships with than with strangers. And people are more honest, kind, compassionate, fair. The integrity goes up when people are known. So if men and women and children with disabilities live in isolation, then these things are missing in their lives. And consequently, these are the things that make our communities better and make us better as people and as a society. But there's even more than that. We know that people get jobs not based on their resume, they get jobs based on their connections and relationships. It's not what you know, ladies and gentlemen, it's who you know that is the driving force of getting a job. And virtually everyone that's looking for a job has to list at least 3 people on their application. This is your social capital that will lie for you during a job interview, right? So the notion of social capital is that it is fundamental to a better life and to a better society. Because without friends, ladies and gentlemen, the world is a wilderness. And if somebody doesn't have friends in their lives, then we are doing the wrong thing in our supports and our services. Robert Putnam, sociologist from Harvard, who's one of the preeminent researchers on social capital, says, if you belong to no community and you decide to join one, you cut your risk of dying in half over the next year. So if you don't remember anything I say tonight, go out and join something. And we'll see you next year for our celebration. Because it's our relationships that sustain life, and it's isolation that leads to people dying. So, how do we develop social capital? As you know, tonight I had a wonderful opportunity to meet some of the newer staff at LiveWorkPlay. These are fine people, really, really passionate, dedicated people. And we talked about 2 ingredients to relationships: similarity and regularity. And the more similarity that you have to people, the more they begin to see their own self in you. So rather than think about somebody's difference, their Down syndrome, their autism, their cerebral palsy, what can we do to look at what makes people similar to each other and then create those bridges? And then once we have the bridges, we then look to have people begin to regularly experience community. We find social capital in a lot of places, a lot of platforms in life. And so, in some ways, how can we grow the possibilities for some of the men and women that are members of Live, Work, Play? I just wanted to share with you that I'm a Big Bang Theory junkie. I love the Big Bang Theory. And I want to just show you that one of the episodes on the Big Bang Theory dealt with friendship. And if you know the story of the Big Bang Theory, there are 4 incredibly intelligent scientists, all who struggle socially to build relationships. And the lead character in the storyline, Sheldon Cooper, figured out that he needed more friends. As he looked at his life, he only had 3.5 friends. And he figured he needed more friends. So as a scientist, he looked at how can I develop friendships. And he went to a bookstore and he got a children's book about friendships. The book was called Stu the Cockatoo is New at the Zoo. And so he read the book and he distilled all the constructs and he created an algorithm for friendship. And in some ways, as silly as this is, there is an algorithm for friendship. And it's an algorithm that every one of us in this room have experienced somehow, some way in our lives. That all of our friendships really start first with our similarity. But it's not just the similarity, it's where do other people who share that similarity gather. I mean, we look around this room, 350 people who have come together, and we have one similarity that bonds every one of us in this room, right? We care about a more inclusive community. We all want to see a better Ottawa. We all want a place where people can thrive, and not just thrive, but be celebrated. And so this notion of creating these bridges of affinity lead us to the point of where do other people celebrate what we celebrate. And then what's expected of people, and then finally gatekeepers. Gatekeepers are critical to community building. These are the men and women that open up the gates and welcome new people in. In many ways, we hope every one of you tonight continue to be gatekeepers in your world. And as you open up the gates so that people who have been left behind can cross over that bridge and come in, you will do more to change community and to change society than you know. So, in many ways, we need to talk about this and continue this discussion with our board of directors, with each other, with our staff, with our families, as we continue to push this forward. Because the magic of social capital is when similarities override differences. When people saw my cousin Carrie's similarities, her differences really didn't matter anymore. And so, connection with people takes us deeper into our own souls, ladies and gentlemen. And that's true for every one of us in this room. This is not for people with disabilities. It's for all of us. Because through others, we get to know ourselves better. This deeper fulfillment is the fuel that helps us lead a better life. And it enlivens our humanness. Our humanness. It enlivens it. So connect with people and do it often. Because our lives are really measured not so much in the titles we hold or the degrees we have or the money we make. It's really measured in how we touch the lives of other people. And I just want to finish this talk with a story about an experience I had with my dad. When my dad was toward the end of his experience with Parkinson's, this was about 2 weeks before he died, he was in need of almost full attendant care and full support. And so my brother Dave and I began to do full-time attendant care for our dad. And we took turns, and my brother Dave took 1 week, I took another week. And one night I was giving my dad a bath. This was about 2 weeks before he passed. And I was washing him in the tub, and my dad started to cry. And I was really taken aback by that. I had seen my dad cry before. My dad has been my hero, my mentor. And I had seen him cry, but usually when he cried, it was always tears of joy. Somebody getting married, a new baby happening, a good thing happening in our family. And here he was. This was a different set of tears. And I didn't know how to handle it. I said, "Dad, there's no crying in the bathtub." I made a joke, right? And my dad said, "I didn't want this for you." And I said, "What?" He said, "I didn't want you to have to take care of me." And I said, "Dad, this is the circle of life, is it not?" I said, "You took care of me when I was a baby and when I was young, and now as your needs have changed, I'm taking care of you, and I'm happy to do it. I'm happy to give you a bath and to take care of you. This is not a burden on me." And then my dad said something that made me cry. He said, "I don't want you to remember me like this." And I didn't know how to handle that, and I started to cry. And then I realized at that moment that my dad was giving me a gift. He was handing me an opportunity to tell him how much I loved him and how we will remember him and how important he was to our family. Because, ladies and gentlemen, at the end of all of our roads, the most important thing that we're going to be remembered for, or the most important thing we are going to remember, is how we touch the lives of other people. And so I really want to thank you for coming out tonight and for being a part of this celebration and showing your support, not